The night watchman who heard things underground. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stood in a place that felt unfinished? Not just because it was under construction, but because it felt like something beneath it had never stopped building? This story is about a man named Elias, 58 years old, ex-construction worker turned night watchman. He didn't talk much, didn't need much, didn't believe in ghosts or curses or anything that didn't wear steel-toed boots. So when he was offered the job watching over the abandoned excavation site outside of Cleveland, he said yes without hesitation. The site was a failed development project, some luxury condos that had run out of funding halfway through. All that remained was a pit 30 feet deep, lined with half-finished retaining walls, metal scaffolding, and rebar sticking out like bones. No real structures, just concrete and dirt. But there had been accidents. One man went missing during the final weeks of construction. Another was found at the bottom of the pit, spine shattered, eyes wide open. After that, the company shut it all down. Didn't even bother to clean the place up. Just post a sign. No entry after dark. That's where Elias came in. His first few nights were uneventful. The only light came from a trailer office at the edge of the site. He had a lantern, a thermos of coffee, and an old radio that only picked up static. He did rounds every hour, checked the fence, walked the perimeter. The pit stayed quiet, still heavy with silence. But on the fourth night, he heard something. At first, it was just a low thumping, rhythmic, like someone knocking gently from far below. He thought it was just settling earth, maybe rodents. But then came the chanting. Low, muffled, not in English, not angry, not urgent, just steady, like a prayer looped under the soil. He leaned over the edge of the pit, listened, nothing. He lit a cigarette, shrugged it off. But the moment he turned his back, the knocking started again. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Like code. He didn't sleep well the next morning. Dreamed of hands pushing up from beneath gravel. He told himself it was just nerves. The next night, same thing. This time louder. Not just knocks. Scratching. Like fingers dragging across wood. Except there was no wood down there, only concrete. He started keeping his rounds shorter, stayed closer to the trailer. He tried playing the radio louder. Didn't help, because the noise wasn't outside anymore. It was beneath him, in the floor, in the pipes, in the silence between his thoughts. On the 7th night, Elias brought a flashlight and a crowbar. He wasn't afraid. Not yet, just tired. Tired of the knocking. Tired of the whispering. Tired of wondering if he was losing his mind or if something was trying to speak through the dirt. Around midnight, he climbed down into the pit. The ladder groaned beneath his weight. 30 feet below ground, the air was damp. Still, it smelled like copper and wet stone. His boots crunched over gravel and fragments of shattered concrete. His flashlight cut through the dust. He walked slowly, circling the bottom of the site. Everything looked the same as it had during the day, except there was a wooden crate near the far wall, half buried in rubble. He didn't remember seeing it before. It looked old, too old to be part of the modern construction. No labels. No hardware, just thick, rotting planks bound together with blackened rope, and it was moving, just barely, as if something inside it was shifting with breath. Elias froze. The knocking began again, but now it wasn't muffled. It was coming directly from the crate. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. He stepped closer, pressed the end of his crowbar against the lid. The wood was soft, too soft, like flesh. He pulled away, but the crate knocked again. And this time, the chanting started. Louder, still not in English, still not human. The words echoed through the pit walls, low and slow, like teeth grinding through water. And then, from inside the crate, a voice, his own voice, whispering, "Don't let them forget me." He staggered backward, dropped the flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the walls, flashing over shapes, symbols, carved into the stone around the crate. Circles, eyes, a spiral of hands reaching inward, and the dirt beneath his feet shifted, like something was turning over beneath the surface. He grabbed the flashlight and climbed the ladder 2 steps at a time. He didn't look back, didn't stop until he was inside the trailer, door locked, hands shaking. Outside, the pit had gone quiet again. The next morning, he called construction office, asked for records. They said no crate was ever documented. No one materials were ever buried. That part of the land had been solid before excavation, but Elias didn't believe them. Not anymore. He'd heard his own voice from inside that box. Elias returned to the site just before dusk. He brought kerosene. He brought a lighter. He brought a prayer, whispered under his breath, even though he didn't believe in much of anything anymore. He had spent the day trying to forget the voice that came out of the crate, his own voice. Don't let them forget me. But how could he forget that? He climbed back down into the pit. The crate was still there, untouched, unmoving, but the ground around it had cracked, as if the earth had breathed outward during the night. He poured the kerosene slowly, all over the wood, into the cracks, around the symbols on the floor, and then he lit it. The flame caught fast, bright yellow and red, but no smoke rose. No heat hit his skin, and instead of the wood blackening and curling into ash, the crate absorbed the fire. It soaked it in, like a sponge. The flames twisted, folded in on themselves, turned blue, then violet, and the chanting began again. Only this time, it wasn't under the pit. It was around him. The walls echoed with voices, some male, some female, some that didn't sound human at all. One phrase, repeated over and over. One must stay. One must speak. One must stay. One must speak. Elias stumbled back. He tried to climb the ladder, but it was gone. Gone. The walls stretched higher, endless. The pit was no longer 30 feet deep. It was a chasm. He turned, looked back at the crate. It had opened, and inside was nothing. No bones, no body, no object, just blackness. And in that blackness, he saw himself, standing at the top of the pit, looking down, expressionless, still, watching. He screamed. No echo, only silence. He backed into the far wall, breathing fast. And then, a whisper from inches behind his ear. You were supposed to listen. In the trailer. The next morning, the day shift guard arrived to relieve Elias. But the trailer was empty. No signs of struggle. No equipment out of place. Only Elias's jacket, folded on the chair, and a single muddy handprint on the inside of the window, too large to be human. The replacement guard's name was Marcus, 33, new to night shifts, didn't ask questions. He was told the previous watchman had quit without notice. Too much quiet, they said, drove him nuts. Marcus figured it'd be an easy gig. sit in the trailer, do a couple rounds, watch for trespassers. He wasn't told about the pit. He wasn't told not to listen too closely. The first night, he noticed a handprint inside the trailer window, larger than his own, dried, smelled like dirt and rust. He wiped it off, didn't think much of it. At midnight, he did his first round. The pit made him uneasy. He didn't like how it pulled the light into itself. He stood at the edge for a moment, listened, and thought he heard singing, faint, melancholy, like a choir underwater. He told himself it was wind through the rebar. But as he turned to leave, 3 knocks from below. He froze, waited, 3 more, steady, precise. He called out, "Anyone down there?" Silence. And then a voice, low, familiar. "Don't let them forget me." Marcus stepped back. He hadn't heard that voice in 10 years. Not since his brother died in a mining collapse out west. But it was his voice, clear as day, calling up from the bottom of the pit. The rest of the shift passed in silence. He didn't sleep the next day. He looked up the site. Nothing online. No building permits. No demolition records. The company website was blank, as if the place never existed. That night, he brought his phone. He recorded the sounds, the knocks, the whispers, but when he played it back, only static. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., a voice in the recording. "You heard us. That makes you the voice now." He dropped the phone. The screen cracked. The trailer lights flickered. And outside from the pit, a figure stood at the edge, watching him, wearing a jacket, holding a crowbar, face hidden in shadow. And in the silence, the sound of chanting began again. One must stay. One must speak. No one saw Marcus after that shift. The company replaced him quietly. Didn't file a report. Didn't call the police. Just posted the same sign again. No entry after dark. And now, sometimes, if you walk by the old excavation site late at night, just close enough to hear the wind through the gravel, you might hear 3 knocks, and then a voice, yours, calling from below, waiting for someone to remember. Episode 2, the long-haul bus driver who took the wrong route. Let me ask you something. Have you ever taken a long-distance bus ride? The kind that stretches across hours of empty highways, strange rest stops, sleeping strangers beside you. The kind of ride where time doesn't feel real anymore. This is the story of a man named Jorge. He drove buses for over 20 years. Reliable, quiet, kept to himself. Night routes mostly. From Texas up to Oregon, across the border sometimes. He liked the silence. The long, empty roads, the way people fell asleep and let him disappear into the dark without questions. He'd seen weird things before, runaway kids, silent passengers who never blinked, people talking to empty seats. But nothing ever stuck with him until Route 217. It wasn't a real route. It wasn't in the system. But one night, dispatch called him. We got an overnight to Idaho. Private hire. Route's been mapped. GPS preloaded. Cash bonus if you don't ask questions. Jorge didn't ask questions. He picked up the bus from the depot. Full tank. Clean interior. There were 9 passengers already on board when he arrived. All silent. All seated. All facing forward. No one spoke when he greeted them. They looked normal, a little pale, dressed for colder weather. Even though it was warm out, he adjusted the mirrors, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot at 11:11 p.m. The first hour passed quietly. Jorge glanced in the mirror a few times. The passengers never moved. No one slept. No one used their phone. No one looked out the window. They just sat, hands in their laps, eyes forward. At 1:13 a.m., he passed a glowing road sign, now entering Cold Hollow. He'd never heard of it. Didn't show on the GPS. He kept driving. Snow began to fall, even though the forecast had called for clear skies. At 2:34 a.m., he checked the rear-view mirror again. There were 10 passengers. He pulled over, got up, counted again. 10, but he remembered 9. Clearly, one in the back. A man in a black coat. Hadn't been there before. He walked down the aisle. "Sir, are you just getting on?" No response. The man didn't move, didn't blink, just looked straight ahead. Jorge reached out. The man turned his head, slowly, and smiled. Too wide, too many teeth. Jorge stumbled back. The man didn't follow, didn't move again, just sat there. He returned to the driver's seat. The GPS had changed. New directions. A looping line. Destination now said home. He tried to turn around. The road behind him was gone. Just snow and pine trees. The headlights couldn't reach more than a few feet ahead. And behind him, none of the passengers were visible in the mirror anymore. Just empty seats. And the faint sound of breathing. Jorge didn't remember falling asleep. But when his eyes opened, the bus was still moving. Same road, same trees, same snow, fall without end. The radio crackled softly with static, though he hadn't turned it on. He checked the mirror again. Still no passengers in sight, just empty seats. But the breathing was louder now, like a slow wind weaving through the cabin. And when he adjusted the mirror, all 10 passengers were back. But they were closer, sitting in the front half of the bus, still facing forward, still unmoving, still watching something he couldn't see. He pulled over again. This time, the bus didn't stop immediately. It rolled a few feet past where he braked, as if it were reluctant to stop. He stepped out into the snow. No sound, no wind, no birds, no cold, just silence. He walked a few feet into the trees with his flashlight, then noticed something odd. The same mile marker was on every tree. Mile 0, mile 0, mile 0. He turned back toward the road, but the bus wasn't there. Just more trees. He spun around, disoriented. And then, headlights blinked on in the distance. Far away, but pointed straight at him. A bus. His bus. He walked toward it. But with every step, it didn't get closer. It got smaller. And inside, through the windshield, he saw himself, driving, expressionless, focused. He woke up behind the wheel, hands on the steering wheel, radio still crackling, the road endless. The GPS now said, "You are here." He looked in the mirror. The passengers were standing now, all 10 of them, facing the front of the bus. Each one staring directly at him. No expression, no sound. Then, one by one, they began to smile. The man in the black coat stepped into the aisle, took one step closer, then another, and when Jorge tried to blink, he realized his eyes weren't responding. Neither were his hands, neither were his feet. He was still, frozen, watching the man walk closer in the mirror until he reached the front, stood beside him, leaned down, and whispered, "Thank you for bringing us home. Now it's your turn." Jorge didn't know how long he'd been driving. He couldn't remember the last stop. Couldn't remember the last real road sign. Only trees, snow, and faces in the mirror that grew more familiar each time he looked. They were changing. Each passenger's face slowly morphing into someone he recognized. A cousin who died in a car crash. A neighbor who vanished years ago. A boy he saw once on a missing poster in El Paso. The man in the black coat, now sitting directly behind him, was himself. Younger, smiling, watching. He tried to speak. No words. He tried to press the brakes. No response. His hands rested on the wheel, unmoving, like they were part of the machine now. The GPS blinked again. It no longer said, "You are here." Now it said, "Coal Hollow Terminal, 0.1 miles." The trees began to thin. The road widened. And ahead, lights, dim yellow ones, buzzing quietly. A platform appeared. Wooden, empty, covered in snow that never stuck. A small sign. Coal Hollow, last stop. The bus slowed on its own. Came to a stop with a soft hiss. No sound from the passengers. Until the doors opened. Then, all at once, they stood together, synchronized, and silently filed out into the snow. No bags, no voices, just footsteps, crunching across the ground until they disappeared into the woods. All except one, the man in the black coat, the one who looked like Jorge. He stepped off last, then turned around, and spoke for the first time. Every driver gets one route. You brought them back. Now drive them again until someone else takes your place. He smiled, wider than any human should, and faded into the snow. The doors closed. The bus idled. Jorge's hands returned to the wheel, and behind him, 9 new passengers, all silent, all staring forward, all waiting to be taken home. The GPS reset. Next stop, Coal Hollow. Estimated time of arrival, 11:11 p.m. Episode 3. The funeral home assistant who prepared the same body twice. Let me ask you something. Do you believe the dead can return? Not as ghosts, not as shadows, but as if they never left. As if they were just passing through and came back the same way they left, wearing the same face, the same silence. But something in their eyes says, "You buried me too early." This story is about a man named Clive. He was 41, quiet, clean, professional. Worked nights at a family-run funeral home just outside of Missouri. Did the preparation work. Cleaning, embalming, dressing the bodies. He'd done hundreds of them. Never flinched. Never believed in anything spiritual. Always said, a body's just a body once the light goes out. That changed last fall. The call came in late. A middle-aged man found dead in his apartment. No signs of struggle. Heart failure, they said. Clive signed the paperwork. Received the body. Logged the name, Peter Mallory, age 53. He remembered the name because it was so ordinary. Nothing strange about Peter. His body was thin, clean, expression neutral. No marks, no signs of pain. Clive did the usual. Washed him, prepped him, set his hands, closed the eyes. He worked alone as always, music playing softly from the old speaker in the corner. All went smoothly until he began to stitch the mouth closed. That's when Peter's hand twitched. Just once. Fingers barely flexing. Clive froze. He checked the vitals. No heartbeat. No breath. No pulse. Dead. Absolutely dead. He told himself it was just muscle memory. A final nerve reflex. He'd seen it once or twice before. He continued. 2 days later, the body was gone. Buried. Routine. Clive moved on to the next one. Until the following week. A familiar name on the log sheet. Peter Mallory. Same age. Same address. Same cause of death. Clive blinked. Called the front office. Is this a typo? The receptionist checked. Nope. Body just arrived. He walked to the back. Unzipped the bag. It was him. Peter. Same scar on his eyebrow. Same freckle on the cheek. Same stitch line along the jaw. The one Clive had made himself. But no signs of decomposition. No embalming fluid smell. No trace of the makeup he'd applied just last week. The body was fresh. Untouched. He ran to check the records. Found the burial log. Peter Mallory was buried 6 days ago. Plot 17B. He drove to the cemetery. Found the headstone. Dug down just enough to confirm the coffin was still there. It was sealed, unopened, and inside a weight, a body. But the Peter on his prep table was back in the mortuary, waiting, still, as if nothing had ever happened. Clive didn't sleep that night. He sat in the embalming room, staring at Peter Mallory's body. Same features. Same faint scar above the left brow. Same skin tone. Same hands, long, slightly crooked middle finger on the right hand. Identical. But this time, Clive noticed something new. A bruise on the chest. Dark. Spreading outward like a ripple. It hadn't been there the first time. He was sure of it. And the strangest part? It looked fresh. As if the man had just died hours ago. The next morning, Clive checked the intake forms again. Signed by the coroner. Same name. Same address. Same time of death. Exactly 1 week apart. Peter Mallory. He ran a background check. There were no public records for Peter. No driver's license. No social security. No family listed. No obituary. Nothing. Just one line in the funeral home system. Prepaid client. Reoccurring file. Clive blinked. Reoccurring? He clicked into the system's back end. Accessed the archive logs. What he found chilled him. Peter Mallory's name had appeared 14 times. Going back over 50 years. Always the same name. Always the same address. Always the same appearance. Same age. Same body. Always arriving within 7 days of the last burial. He printed the records. Took them to the director of the funeral home, Mr. Jenner, an old man, pale, quiet, always watching. When Clive handed him the papers, Jenner didn't even flinch. He just said, "You're not the first to notice." Clive asked, "Then why do we keep burying him?" Jenner folded the papers slowly. "You don't bury Peter Mallory to get rid of him. You bury him to delay him." "Delay what?" Jenner looked him in the eye, then said, "His return." That night, Clive snuck back into the embalming room. Peter's body was still there, still perfect, still stitched at the mouth. But now, his eyes were open, just a sliver, enough to see the whites, and something moving beneath the surface. Not decay, not blood, but shadows, twisting, coiling, as if the body were filled with smoke instead of flesh. And then, one of Peter's fingers twitched again. This time it curled, toward Clive, like a beckoning. Clive stood frozen in the embalming room. Peter's eyes were now fully open, cloudy but focused, and they were looking directly at him. The stitched mouth hadn't moved, but Clive could hear something. Not out loud, not in the room, but inside his own mind. A whisper, low, like something speaking through 100 layers of soil. It has to be someone. One soul in, one soul out. Clive stepped back. Peter's hand shifted again. Then the other, both arms rising slowly. Too slowly, as if the body were fighting its own stiffness. And then he sat up. The stitches on his mouth stretched, but didn't tear. His jaw remained shut, but the whispers grew louder. Images flooded Clive's head. Flashes of places he'd never been. A narrow tunnel of roots and bone. A door beneath a lake. A woman clawing at her own reflection. And rows of bodies. Each one with Peter Mallory's face. Until one row showed Clive's. And beneath every version of Clive. Next, he ran. Out of the room. Out into the night. He drove 3 towns over. Didn't sleep, didn't eat, just stared at the highway lines until morning came. When he returned to the funeral home, no one remembered Peter, not the receptionist, not Jenner, no records in the system. The name Peter Mallory was gone, but the embalming room was cold, and on the table, Clive's jacket, folded, neat, with a single piece of paper on top. No handwriting, just one sentence typed. Now they'll bury you. That week, a new body arrived at the funeral home. No ID, no known family. Estimated age, 41. Male, slight scar above the left eyebrow. His name on the intake form, Clive Mallory. Episode 4. The janitor who cleaned the school after midnight. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked through your old school at night? No students. No noise. Just a hum of old lights. The echo of your own footsteps. And the feeling that the building remembers more than it lets on. This story is about a man named Milton. He was 62. Worked as a janitor at a public middle school in Ohio. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet. And that's what Milton liked most. The quiet. He worked a late shift. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Alone, just the way he wanted it. He knew every inch of building. Every creaky locker. Every broken light. He'd worked there for over 20 years. But something changed one Tuesday in October. He was mopping the second floor when he noticed it. A hallway he didn't recognize. It wasn't new. The floor tiles were old, scuffed. The lights were flickering. The lockers were rusted. But it wasn't there the night before. He pulled out the map taped to his cart. There was nothing between rooms 213 and 215. Just a wall. But now there was a hallway, about 50 feet long. At the end, a single classroom door, half open. He thought maybe he'd miss a renovation. Maintenance didn't always update him. So he walked down the hall. As he moved, the sound changed. The hum of lights faded, replaced by a soft static, like a television left on in another room. He reached the door. The plaque read, Room 237A. That wasn't a real room. Not in this school. Not in any wing. He stepped inside. It was a classroom. Desks, chalkboard, books on the shelves. But all of it was old. Too old. Chalkboard instead of whiteboard. Desks with inkwells. No computer ports. No lights. Just windows covered in heavy gray curtains. And worst of all, dustless, like it had just been cleaned. He backed out of the room, turned around. The hallway behind him was gone. Just a blank wall, painted, seamless, as if he'd never come that way. And when he turned back, the classroom was no longer empty. A woman stood at the front, teacher's dress, hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes wrong, too far apart, too round. Her voice scraped across the walls. "You're not supposed to be here after the bell." Milton blinked. The woman at the front of the classroom hadn't moved. Her arms hung stiff at her sides. Her mouth was smiling, but her eyes didn't blink. She stepped forward, not walked, glided. Her shoes didn't touch the ground. Milton turned and ran, but the door had closed. No handle, no lock, no exit, just wood. He turned back. The classroom was full now, every desk occupied by children, but not children, figures, wearing uniforms too stiff, skin too smooth, hair painted onto scalps. Some stared at the chalkboard. Some stared at him. One boy's mouth opened, and a dial tone came out. Milton pounded on the door. It opened on its own. He stumbled out, found himself back in the main hallway. Lights buzzing, map still on the wall. The mystery hallway was gone. He ran, downstairs, out the emergency exit, into the parking lot. But the lot was empty. No stars, no wind, just a single school bus, headlights on, facing the door. He turned. The building was different, older, crumbling. No security lights, no banners, no modern signs, as if he'd stepped 50 years into the past. He went home, didn't sleep. Next day, he told the principal. She looked at him with concern. "There's no room 237A, Milton. I was inside it." She shook her head. "We've never had that many rooms." He checked the blueprints in the archives. No record. But there, tucked in the back of a folder, he found an old disciplinary notice, typed on typewriter. Date, October 1966. Custodian Milton J. Reeves reprimanded for entering room 237, A without authorization. Same name, same handwriting as his, same signature. Only Milton was born in 1961. That night, the hallway was back. Same flickering light, same door at the end, same room number. This time, the door was already open, and inside, a mop bucket, waiting, with his name etched into the side. Milton J. Reeves, night shift. Milton stared at the mop bucket. His name hadn't been written on a tag or a label. It was carved, etched deep, like the metal had softened just to accept it. And next to the name, a date. October 13th, 1966. Exactly 56 years ago to the day. But the bucket was spotless, like it had never been used, or never needed to be used. Until now, he stepped into room 237A. The mannequins weren't there tonight. Neither was the teacher. The classroom looked waiting, as if it had been reset. A single note was left on the teacher's desk. Typewritten, "You must finish what they didn't. 1 week. Clean everything. No mistakes." Below it, a list, floor, desks, windows, mirrors, basement. Milton blinked. Basement? This school didn't have one. But the note didn't care. He picked up the mop. It was heavy. Too heavy. He dipped it into the water. But when it came out, the mop was black, covered in thick sludge that smelled like rotten oil. He tried to wipe it on the floor. The stain he left behind began to move. Not spread, not soak in. Move, like something beneath the tiles was shifting to meet it. He dropped the mop. The door slammed shut. Behind him, the chalkboard began to write on its own. One word. Continue. For 6 nights, Milton returned. Each time, the list grew shorter. Each time, the building changed. The lights dimmed faster. The mannequins returned, this time watching him from the windows. The teacher never spoke again, but her eyes blinked, and sometimes they followed him. He cleaned, he mopped, he scrubbed a floor that bled if he stopped for too long. He washed mirrors that didn't reflect the room he was in. And every night, the last item on the list remained. Basement. On the seventh night, the floor of room 237A opened. Stairs. Downward. Made of stone. Lit by flickering lamps that weren't electric. He descended. The mop in his hand felt colder now, like it belonged down there. The air grew damp. And at the bottom of the stairs, a corridor filled with rows of janitor buckets, each with a name, each with a date, none more recent than the 1970s, all facing the same wall. At the far end, one empty space, a slot, waiting. Milton placed his bucket inside. It clicked, and the wall in front of him became a mirror. He saw himself, older, tired, but not just tired, worn, like he'd been cleaning this place for longer than a week. He blinked. His reflection didn't. It smiled and said, "Shift complete. Next janitor arrives tomorrow." The next night, a new custodian took the night shift. Young, eager, didn't believe in ghost stories until he found a hallway between rooms 213 and 215, one that wasn't on the map. At the end, room 237A, and on the teacher's desk, a list. At the top, "Welcome, Milton." Episode 5, the grave digger who found a coffin that wasn't buried yet. Let me ask you something. When you think of a grave, what do you picture? Fresh earth, a shovel, a box being lowered in. But what if you arrived to dig the grave and found the coffin already waiting? Not buried, not old, just there, and inside, someone who looks like you. This is the story of a man named Reed, 47, grave digger for a small-town cemetery in Montana. Hard-working, private, preferred the night shifts, said the ground was softer when the sun went down. No one asked what he meant. He worked alone, didn't mind, said the dead were better company than the living. Until the Thursday evening, he was sent to prep plot 39F. The office said the family had paid in advance. Delivery was scheduled for the next morning. Reed grabbed his shovel, lantern, and thermos, walked out past the fence, where the older graves lay forgotten in long, crooked rows. Plot 39F was near the farthest edge of the cemetery. No lights, just dirt, thorns, and trees that leaned too close. When he arrived at the site, something stopped him cold. The grave was already open, perfectly dug. No soil nearby, like it had never been touched. And at the bottom, a coffin, shiny, black, new. It wasn't supposed to be there. No one had been scheduled to deliver it. He climbed down to inspect. No markings, no nameplate, but the lid was loose, not nailed shut. He pried it open, and inside was him. Eyes closed, hands folded, same scar above the right eyebrow, same silver ring, same shovel resting beside the body. Reed stumbled back, dropped the lantern. It didn't break, but the light went out, and in the silence, he heard breathing, but not from the coffin. From behind him, Reed turned. Nothing behind him. No shadows. No movement. Just a cold breeze slipping through the crooked trees. He climbed out of the grave, grabbed a lantern, still warm but unlit. He lit it again. The flame flickered low, unsteady, almost like it didn't want to stay. He looked back into the grave. The coffin was closed again, but he hadn't touched it. The lid was sealed, and the dirt he'd seen before, now piled neatly beside the grave. Shovel stuck in the center. Waiting, he walked back toward the tool shed. It should have been a straight path. He passed an angel statue, then a line of rusted iron gates, then a row of infant graves from the 1930s, then plot 39F, same pile of dirt, same closed coffin, same lantern flicker. He turned around, walked the other way, slower this time, counting steps, 25, 30, then plot 39F again. Now the coffin was open, empty. He ran, north, south, didn't matter. No matter where he went, the same grave waited, plot 39F. But something changed each time he returned. The air grew colder. The trees leaned in closer. The headstones changed angles, pointing toward the grave. And finally, on the fifth loop, there was a second coffin beside the first. Smaller, wooden, old-fashioned, the kind they stopped using decades ago. No lid this time, just a black sheet draped over something. That moved. Reed stepped closer. The sheet rose, barely, and he heard his own voice whisper from beneath it. "You left me here once. Now I'm leaving you." Reed backed away, tripped, fell against a headstone, looked up, a third coffin, this one still breathing. The wood rose and fell, steadily, rhythmically. He stared at it, whispered, "Who are you?" The breathing stopped. A hand slid up from inside, thin, gray, identical to his. It pointed at the pile of dirt beside the grave, then at him. Reed didn't move. The hand from the third coffin pointed at him again, then slowly lowered, disappearing beneath the lid. The wood sealed shut on its own. The breathing stopped, but the whisper returned. Low, close, inside his head. The job ends when you accept it. He turned to run again, but this time he didn't move. His legs wouldn't respond. He looked down. His boots were sinking, slowly, into the dirt. No mud, no struggle, just a soft pull, as if the cemetery had decided you've been walking above long enough. He yanked one foot free, then the other, fell back, gasping, and saw that the three coffins had changed. Now, only one remained, open, empty, waiting, with a shovel across its chest, and his name carved into the lid. Reed Morrow, night digger, in service since 1999. Release, never. He screamed. No echo. The cemetery wasn't a place anymore. It was a loop, a ritual, a trap, and he had already dug too many graves for others, never realizing each one made his deeper. He stumbled to the headstone nearest him, tried to pull himself up, but the name etched into the stone was also his, not past tense, not in loving memory, just Reed Morrow, transferring positions, and then a figure stepped out from behind the angel statue, wearing the same uniform, same build, same tired eyes, but older, much older. The man walked calmly to the open grave, looked down at it, then at Reed, and said, "You're ready?" They always fight the last loop. Reed backed away. No, I'm not ready." The man placed a hand on his shoulder. It was cold, soft, not flesh, soil. You've already been buried, son. Now it's your turn to hold the shovel. The next morning, a new worker arrived at the cemetery. Young, fresh boots, tidy gloves. Asked the office assistant where Reed was. She looked confused. There's no Reed on the schedule, but he's been working nights here for years. She checked the file, shook her head. There's only ever been one night digger out there, and you're the first in a long time. The young man walked toward the backfields. Plot 39F was already open, lantern lit, shovel resting on the edge, and just beneath the dirt, something whispered, "Welcome to the shift." Episode 6. The nurse who watched patients vanish without dying. Let me ask you something. Have you ever visited someone in the hospital and felt like there was something wrong with the room itself? Not the person, not the doctors. The room, like it had seen too much, held too many endings. This is the story of a nurse named Julie, 45, 10 years in emergency care, 6 in general recovery, no nonsense, steady hands, respected by her staff. Julie worked at St. Hedwig's Medical Center in Michigan. The hospital was old, brick hallways, polished floors, flickering elevator lights, but it was reliable until last March when Room 205 was reopened. Room 205 had been sealed for over a year. Flooding issue. That's what they said. But Julie remembered the truth. A patient vanished from there. A man recovering from surgery. Vitals stable. Monitored overnight. Gone by morning. No signs of struggle. No security footage. No discharge papers. Just gone. And when they opened the door, the bed was still warm. Now 205 was active again. Julie's patient that night, Eleanor Price, 74, admitted for dizziness and disorientation. Vitals, normal. Speech, clear. Eyes, alert. She was fine, smiling even. Julie liked her immediately. Eleanor asked gentle questions, talked about her daughter, brought her own quilt from home, told Julie, "You got kind eyes." At 11:14 p.m., Julie checked her one last time. "All good." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you for being here." Julie smiled. "I'll be back in 30 minutes." Eleanor said one more thing before she left the room. "Don't let it in if it knocks, even if it uses my voice." Julie paused. "What?" Eleanor smiled, soft, but her eyes were terrified. "I mean it." Then close her eyes. Julie left the room. Julie couldn't shake Eleanor's words. She'd heard strange things from patients before. Hallucinations, confusion, dementia. But Eleanor had been sharp, clear, and afraid in a way Julie couldn't explain. She made her rounds on the 3rd floor. Room 212, 213, 214. All quiet. At 11:44 p.m., she returned to room 205. Door closed. Lights off. That was strange. She always left one light on for evening observation. She knocked gently. No response. She opened the door. The bed was empty. No Eleanor. No sheets pulled back. No quilt. No signs of movement. Just a faint humming sound. The monitor still displayed a slow, steady pulse. But the heart sensors weren't attached to anyone. She stepped into the room, and the monitor flatlined. One long tone. She ran to check the hall. No one had seen Eleanor leave. No security buzz at the door. The cameras? Offline. Of course. She reported the disappearance immediately. Security sweep. Maintenance check. Nothing. Her supervisor blamed her. "You left the patient unattended." Julie protested. She was there, and then she wasn't. And camera feed? Offline. Convenient. They sent her home early, told her to take a few days. But she couldn't stop thinking about it. She needed answers. So the next night, she came back. Not as staff, as someone visiting a friend. She stayed near 205, waited. Nothing happened until 2:05 a.m. Knocking, 3 soft taps. From inside the room, she froze. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle. But she remembered Eleanor's warning. Don't let it in if it knocks. She backed away. The knocking came again, harder. Then a voice. Her voice. "Jewel, it's me. I'm cold. Please let me out." She looked under the door. No shadow, just silence. And then a whisper at her ear. It gets in when you answer. She turned. No one there. She looked back at the door. It was now open, wide, and room 205 wasn't a room anymore. Julie stood in the doorway. The lights inside flickered like candlelight, but there were no candles, no bulbs, no walls, just fog. The entire room had been swallowed by a thick, pale mist. The hospital bed was gone. So was the monitor, the oxygen line, the 4-stand. Only one thing remained. Eleanor's quilt, folded on the floor. Still warm. Julie stepped in. The fog swallowed the hallway behind her. No more doors. No more nurses. No more sound. Only the soft hum of breathing. Somewhere deeper in the mist, she walked forward. Her shoes echoed, though the floor was carpeted now. A hallway stretched in front of her, too long, too narrow, and the walls lined with doors, each one marked 205, 205, 205, 205, each with a small glass window. Inside the first one, a patient sleeping. Not Eleanor. Someone else. Still breathing. Eyes twitching. Trapped in a dream they couldn't wake from. Julie opened another door. Another patient. Eyes wide open. Frozen. Mouth parted as if mid-scream. But no sound. A third door. And this time, herself. Lying in bed, heartbeat monitor steady, chest rising and falling. But her eyes were missing, not bloodied, not hollow, just blank skin, a voice behind her. They can't see anymore. That's why you're here. She turned. Eleanor stood in the fog, but her face was wrong. Soft, too smooth, and her mouth moved. But her voice didn't come from it. You see too much, Julie. That's the problem. Room 205 doesn't take everyone. It waits for watchers. Julie backed away. No, I'm not staying. Eleanor tilted her head. You already did. And pointed at a 5th door. Inside, Julie, sitting in a hospital chair, staring blankly at the wall. No movement, no blinking, just stillness. A nurse walked past in the real world. Didn't look at her, didn't see her, like she wasn't there. Julie ran, down the hall, through the fog, calling for help, but the doors kept repeating. 205, 205, 205, 205, and each one held another version of her, sleeping, screaming, watching, smiling, until she reached the final door. It was made of glass, and on the other side, St. Hedwig's Hospital, the hallway, the lights, her reflection. She placed her hand on the glass. It was warm, soft, and then from the other side, her reflection moved on its own, smiled, and walked away, leaving Julie inside.